If we're going to talk about monetary policy, we have to talk about the agency in charge of monetary policy, and that's the central bank. Now, every developed country, developed in terms of the economy, has a central bank, and the central bank for the United States is the Federal Reserve. Sometimes it's called the Federal Reserve System because there's more than one Federal Reserve Bank, and we'll understand that in a second. Now let's understand. Now you have to understand the Federal Reserve is one of the most important governmental institutions there are, and it is unique in many respects, but it is very, very misunderstood and mysterious to many people. So everybody should have a basic understanding of how the Federal Reserve, how the Federal Reserve is structured and how it works. So let's look at the structure of the Fed. And by the way, sometimes we refer to the Federal Reserve as the Fed for short. So the government must regulate bank lending if it wants to control the amount of money in the economy. And when you control the amount of money in the economy, you can control lending and borrowing and interest rates, and you could impact aggregate demand. If the Federal Reserve didn't exist, the supply of money would be determined by simply individual banks. Because remember, banks create most of the money in the economy. Now, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to avert recent financial crises. Now, you keep in mind, 1913, most economies, think about Europe, had central banks long before the United States. The United States was late in creating the central bank. It had made 2 attempts prior to 1913, but they didn't work out. And so 1913, the Federal Reserve came into existence. And what they did is they divided the United States into 12 districts, banking districts. And each district has a Federal Reserve Bank that's supposed to represent the banking interests of that region. Now, the Federal Reserve performs services such as clearing checks between private banks. So when you write a check from your Wells Fargo account and you give it to somebody who has a Bank of America account, one of the things the Federal Reserve does is it debits and credits the Wells Fargo account and the Bank of America account. That's clearing checks. It holds bank reserves. If you want to be a bank, a commercial bank in the United States, you have to join the Federal Reserve System. And one of the requirements of joining the Federal Reserve System is you've got to keep some of your reserves with the Federal Reserve. And it's in charge of providing currency to the public. Even though the Department of Treasury, which is not part of the Federal Reserve, even though the Treasury prints money, it does so at the request and direction of the Federal Reserve. And it provides loans to private banks. So if a private bank is in trouble and no one else will loan them money, they could possibly go to the Federal Reserve for a loan. So commercial banks in particular, in a particular region, Federal Reserve region, must subscribe to stock in the regional Federal Reserve Bank in the amount of 3% of their capital and surplus. That's a fancy way of saying that they've got to join the Federal Reserve and buy stock in the Federal Reserve. So this is one of the unique aspects of the Federal Reserve. It's what you call a quasi-governmental agency. Private banks belong to the Federal Reserve System, but there's also a governmental component to it. That's why they call it a quasi-governmental agency. Now, the holding of the stock, however, does not carry with it control and financial interest conveyed to bondholders of common stock in private organizations. So when you buy common stock in, let's say, Google, you have some say as to who is on the board of directors. And the board of directors basically manage the CEO. That's not quite how it works for the Federal Reserve. It's merely a legal obligation that goes along with membership, and the stock may not be sold or pledged as collateral for loans. They got to hold on to it. Member banks receive a 6% dividend annually on their stock, as specified by law, and vote for Class A and Class B directors of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, these directors basically are in charge of nominating a president for that particular bank. So the Federal Reserve Bank president, for example, I'm located in San Francisco, and San Francisco is in the 12th district of the Federal Reserve districts, right? And the headquarters for the 12th district for that Federal Reserve Bank is in San Francisco. Now, the banks in that district, basically use their stock to vote for directors, and the directors hire a president, and that president of that bank is supposed to go to Washington and represent the banking interests of that region. Now, there's a federal oversight, there's a federal government component to the Federal Reserve, and those are called the Board of Governors. The Fed is controlled by a 7-person Board of Governors, so there's 7 of them. Each governor is appointed to a 14-year term by the President of the United States, but it has to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Now, the reason why they have a 14-year term is this is the attempt to insulate each governor from political influence. Since presidents can serve only 4-year terms and a total of 2 terms, once nominated and confirmed by the Senate, the governor is kind of released from pressure from the president, because the president can't say, I'm going to not renominate you, because that president will be out of office by the time the governor is up for renomination. Now, of the 7 governors, 1 governor is selected to be the chairperson, and that chairperson serves a 4-year term. So the the chairman or chairperson of the Federal Reserve is a governor that serves on 4-year terms. Now, that's the person who basically runs the Federal Reserve, the chairperson of the Fed. Now, I told you about those 14-year terms, and that was a way to make the Federal Reserve politically independent. Well, the reason why is because one of the key mandates of the Federal Reserve is to make sure that inflation is relatively low and stable. When the Federal Reserve, when any central bank is motivated by political interests, inflation tends to be a problem. That's because during re-election, you want the economy going really, really well if you want to get re-elected, and you may push the Federal Reserve to expand the money supply, to lower interest rates, to boost economic growth. But that could come at the cost of higher inflation. And what we see here is this nice graphic that shows inflation on the vertical axis and a way of measuring the independence of a central bank on the horizontal axis. So as you move to the right, that means there's more political independence. And as you move up here, there's more inflation. As you can see, before the creation of the European Union, each European country had their own central bank, and Portugal was relatively had lacked political independence, their central bank. Therefore, they had relatively high inflation. The United States right here has a relatively independent Federal Reserve, and they had relatively low inflation. Even more so, I'm sorry, the United States is, this is Germany right here. Germany has even more independence and even lower average inflation rate, annual inflation rate. And so you could see that there is a correlation, a negative correlation here between political independence and inflation. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at one of the most important policy-making arms of the Federal Reserve. That's the Federal Open Market Committee, sometimes simply called FOMC. Now, the FOMC has 12 members on this committee, all 7 governors and 5 bank presidents. Remember, each region, there are 12 regions in the Federal Reserve. Each region has its own Federal Reserve Bank, and each Federal Reserve Bank has a bank president. 5 of those bank presidents serve on the FOMC. Now, they serve on a rotating basis. So the president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve will vote on this committee, I believe, once every 3 years. So they sit on a rotating basis. With the exception of the Federal Reserve District of New York, the bank president of the New York Fed has a permanent seat on this committee, a voting seat. And so this FOMC, they meet roughly every 4 to 5 weeks. And they announce any changes to monetary policy. Now, in the next video, we're going to be looking at the structure of the Federal Reserve System, and we're going to be looking at all the regions and how they set monetary policy.